Today I'm going to read More Terrifying Tales to Tell at Night. Tonight's story is Here There Be Tigers by Stephen King. Charles needed to go to the bathroom very badly. There was no longer any use in trying to fool himself that he could wait for recess. His bladder was screaming at him, and Miss Bird had caught him squirming. There were 3 third-grade teachers in the Acorn Street Grammar School. Miss Kinney was young and blonde and bouncy, and had a boyfriend who picked her up after school in a blue Camaro. Mrs. Trask was shaped like a Moorish pillow, and did her hair in braids, and laughed boomingly. And there was Miss Bird. Charles had known he would end up with Miss Bird. He had known that. It had been inevitable. Because Miss Bird obviously wanted to destroy him. She did not allow children to go to the basement. The basement, Miss Bird said, was where the boilers were kept, and well-groomed ladies and gentlemen would never go down there, because basements were nasty, sooty old things. Young ladies and gentlemen do not go to the basement, she said. They go to the bathroom. Charles squirmed again. Miss Bird cocked an eye at him. Charles, she said clearly, still pointing her pointer at Bolivia, do you need to go to the bathroom? Kathy Scott, in the seat ahead of him, giggled wisely, covering her mouth. Kenny Griffin sniggered and kicked Charles under his desk. Charles went bright red. Speak up, Charles, Miss Bird said brightly. Do you need to? Urinate. She'll say urinate, she always does. Yes, Miss Bird. Yes, what? I have to go to the bathroom. Miss Bird smiled. Very well, Charles. You may go to the bathroom and urinate. Is that what you need to do? Urinate? Charles hung his head, convicted. Very well, Charles. You may do so. And next time, kindly don't wait to be asked. General giggles. Miss Bird rapped the board with her pointer. Charles trudged up the road toward the door, 30 pairs of eyes boring into his back, and every one of those kids, including Kathy Scott, knew he was going into the bathroom to urinate. The door was at least a football field's length away. Miss Bird did not go on with the lesson, but kept her silence until he had opened the door, entered the blessedly empty hall, and shut the door again. He walked down towards the boys' bathroom. Basement, 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 if I want. Dragging his fingers along the cool tile of the wall, letting them bounce over the thumbtack-stippled bulletin board, and slide lightly across the red, break glass in case of emergency, fire alarm box. Miss Bird liked making him have a red face in front of Kathy Scott, who never needed to go to the basement. It was that fair, and everybody else. Old Bitch, he thought. He spelled because he had decided last year God didn't say it was a sin if you spelled. He went into the boys' bathroom. It was very cool inside, with a faint, not unpleasant smell of chlorine hanging pungently in the air. Now in the middle of the morning, it was clean and deserted, peaceful and quite pleasant. Not at all like the smoky, stinky cubicle at the Star Theater downtown. The bathroom, basement, was built like an L. The short side lined with tiny square mirrors and white porcelain wash bowls and a paper towel dispenser. Niprock. The longer side with 2 urinals and 3 toilet cubicles. Charles went around the corner after glancing morosely at his thin, rather pallid face in one of the mirrors. The tiger was lying down at the far end, just underneath the pebbly white window. It was a large tiger, with tawny Venetian blinds and dark stripes laid across its belt. It looked up alertedly at Charles, and its green eyes narrowed. A kind of silky, purring grunt issued from its mouth. Smooth muscles flexed, and the tiger got to its feet. Its tail switched, making little chinking sounds against the porcelain side of the last urinal. The tiger looked quite hungry and very vicious. Charles hurried back the way he had come. The door seemed to take forever to wheeze pneumatically closed behind him, but when he did, he considered himself safe. This door only swung in, and he could not remember ever reading or hearing that tigers are smart enough to open doors. Charles wiped the back of his hand across his nose. His heart was thumping so hard he could hear it. He still needed to go to the basement. Worse than ever. He squirmed, winced, and pressed his hand against his belly. He really had to go to the basement. If he could only be sure no one would come, he would use the girls. It was right across the hall. Charles looked at it longingly, knowing he would never dare, not in a million years. What if Kathy Scott should come, or Black Horror, or what if Miss Bird should come? Perhaps he had imagined the tiger. He opened the door wide enough for one eye and peeked in. The tiger was peeking back from around the angle of the L, its eyes sparkling green. Charles fancied he could see a tiny blue fleck in that deep brilliance, as if the tiger's eye had eaten one of his own. A hand slid around his neck. Charles gave a stifled cry and felt his heart and stomach cramp up into his throat. For one terrible moment, he thought he was going to wet himself. It was Kenny Griffin, smiling complacently. Miss Bird sent me after you because you've been gone 6 years. You're in trouble. Yeah, but I can't go to the basement, Charles said, feeling faint with the fright Kenny had given him. You're constipated, Kenny chortled gleefully. Wait till I tell Kathy. You better not, Charles said urgently. Besides, I'm not. There's a tiger in there. What's he doing, Kenny asked. Taking a piss? I don't know, Charles said, turning his face to the wall. I just wish he'd go away. He began to weep. Hey, Kenny said, bewildered and a little frightened. Hey, what if I have to go? What if I can't help it? Miss Bird'll say... Come on, Kenny said, grabbing his arm in one hand and pushing the door open with the other. You're making it up. They were inside before Charles, terrified, could break free and cower back against the door. It's around... Okay, wait, Tiger, Kenny said disgustedly. Boy, Miss Bird's gonna kill you. It's around the other side. Kenny began to walk past the wash bowls. Kitty, kitty, kitty. Kitty. Don't, Charles hissed. Kenny disappeared around the corner. Kitty, kitty, kitty. Kitty, kitty, kit. Charles darted out the door again and pressed himself against the wall with his hands over his mouth and his eyes squinched shut, waiting for the scream. There was no scream. He had no idea how long he stood there, frozen, his bladder bursting. He looked at the door to the boys' basement. It told him nothing. It was just a door. He wouldn't. He couldn't. But at last he went in. The wash bowls and mirrors were neat, and the faint smell of chlorine was unchanged. But there seemed to be a smell under it, a faint, unpleasant smell, like freshly sheared copper. With groaning but silent trepidation, he went up to the corner of the L and peeped around. The tiger was sprawled on the floor, licking its large paws with a long pink tongue. It looked incuriously at Charles. There was a torn piece of shirt caught in one set of claws. But his need was a white agony now, and he couldn't help it. He had to. Charles tiptoed back to the white porcelain basin closest to the door. Miss Bird slammed in just in time. He was zipping his pants. Why, you filthy, dirty little boy, she said almost reflectively. Charles was keeping a weather eye on the corner. "I'm sorry, Miss Bird, the tiger. I'm going to clean the sink. I'll use soap. I swear I will." "Where's Kenneth?" Miss Bird asked calmly. "I don't know." "He didn't really. Is he back there?" "No," Charles cried. Miss Bird stalked to the place where the room bent. "Come here, Kenneth, right this moment." "Miss Bird." But Miss Bird was already around the corner. She meant to pounce, Charles thought. But Miss Bird was already around the corner. She meant to pounce. Charles thought Miss Bird was about to find out what pouncing was really all about. He went out the door again. He got a drink at the drinking fountain. He looked at the American flag hanging over the entrance to the gym. He looked at the bulletin board. Woodsy Owl said, "Give a hoot, don't pollute." Officer Friendly said, "Never ride with strangers." Charles read everything twice. Then he went back to the classroom, walked down his row to his seat with his eyes on the floor, and slid into his seat. It was 11:15. He took out Roads to Everywhere and began to read about Bill at the rodeo. So, did it happen or did it not happen? That is the question. This is The Chimney by Ramsey Campbell. Maybe most of it was only fear, but not the last thing, not that. To blame my fear for that would be worst of all. I was 12 years old and beginning to conquer my fears. I even went upstairs to do my homework and managed to ignore the chimney. I had to be brave because of my parents, because of my mother. She had always been afraid for me. The very first day I had gone to school, I'd seen her watching. Her expression had reminded me of the face of a girl I'd glimpsed on television, watching men lock her husband behind bars. I was frightened all the first day. And when children had hysterics or began to bully me, or the teacher lost her temper, these things only confirmed my fears and my mother's when I told her what happened each day. Now I was at grammar school. I'd been there for much of a year. I felt awkward in my new uniform and old shoes. The building seemed enormous, crowded with too many strange children and teachers. I felt I was an outsider. Friendly approaches made me nervous and sullen. When people laughed and I didn't know why, I was sure they were laughing at me. After a while, the other boys treated me as I seemed to want to be treated. The lads from the poorer districts mocked my suburban accent. The suburban boys sneered at my old shoes. Often, I'd sat praying that the teacher wouldn't ask me a question I couldn't answer, sat paralyzed by my dread of having to stand up in the waiting, watchful silence. If a teacher shouted at someone, my heart jumped painfully once I felt the stain of my shock creeping insidiously down my thigh. Yet I did well in the end-of-term examinations because I was terrified of failing. For nights afterward, they were another reason why I couldn't sleep. My mother read the signs of all this on my face. More and more, once I told her what was wrong, I had to persuade her that there was nothing worse that I kept back. Some mornings as I lay in bed, trying to hold back 7:30, I'd be sick. I would grope miserably downstairs, white-faced, and my mother would keep me home. Once or twice, when my fear wasn't quite enough, I'd made myself sick. Look at him. You can't expect him to go like that. But my father would only shake his head and grunt, dismissing us both. I knew my father found me embarrassing. This year, he had less time for me than usual. His shop, the anything shop nearby in the suburbanized village, was failing to compete with the new supermarket. But before that trouble, I'd often see him staring up at my mother and me, both of us taller than him. His eyes said, yet both scared of our own shadows. At those times, I glimpsed his despair. So But my parents weren't reassuring. Yet at night, I tried to stay with them as long as I could, for my worst fears were upstairs, in my room. It was a large room, 2 rooms knocked into one by the previous owner. It overlooked the small back gardens. The smaller the fireplaces had been bricked up in winter, the larger held a fire, which my mother always feared would set fire to the room. But she let it alone, for I'd screamed when I thought she was going to take that light away, even though the firelight only added to the terrors of the room. The shadows moved things. The mesh of the finger guard fluttered, enlarged on the wall sometimes. At the edge of sleep, it became a swaying web, and its spinner came settling down from a corner of the ceiling. Everything was unstable. Walls shifted, my clothes crawled on the back of the chair. Once, when I left my jacket slumped over the chair, the collar's dark upturned lack of a face began to nod forward stealthily. The holes at the ends of the sleeves worked like mouths, and I didn't dare get up to hang the jacket properly. The room grew in the dark. Sounds outside, footsteps and laughter, dogs encouraging each other to bark, only emphasized the size of my trap of darkness, how distant everything else was. And there was a dimmer room in the mirror of a wardrobe beyond the foot of the bed. There was a bed in that room, and beside it a dim night light in a plastic lantern. Once I'd awakened to see a face staring dimly at me from the mirror. A figure had sat up when I had, and I'd almost cried out. Often, I stared at the dim, staring face until I had to hide beneath the sheets. Of course, this couldn't go on for the rest of my life. On my 12th birthday, I set about the conquest of my room. I was happy in my pair of presents. I had a jigsaw, a box of colored pencils, a book of space stories. They had come from my father's shop, but they were mine now. Because I was relaxed, no doubt. Because she wished I could always be so, my mother said. Would you be happier if you went to another school? It was Saturday. I wanted to forget Monday. Besides, I imagined all the schools were as frightening. No, I'm alright, I said. Are you happy at school now? She said incredulously. Yes, it's alright. Are you sure? Yes, really, it's alright. I mean, I'm happy now. The snap of the letter slot saved me from further lying. 3 birthday cards, 2 from neighbors who talked to me when I served them in the shop, an old lady who always carried a poodle, our next-door neighbor, Dr. Flynn, and a card from my parents. I'd seen all 3 cards in the shop, which spoiled them somehow. As I stood in the hall, I heard my father. You've got to control yourself, he was saying. You only upset the child. If you didn't go on at him, he wouldn't be half so bad. It infuriated me to be called a child. But I worry so, my mother said brokenly. He can't look after himself. You don't let him try. You'll have him afraid to go up to bed next. But I already was. Was that my mother's fault? I remember her putting the nightlight in my bed when I was very young, checking the flex and the bulb each night. I'd taken the line awake, dreading one or the other would fail. Standing in the hall, I saw dimly that my mother and I encouraged each other's fears. One of us had to stop. I had to stop. Even when I was frightened, I mustn't let her see. It wouldn't be the first time I'd hidden my feelings from her. In the living room, I said, I'm going upstairs to play. Sometimes in summer, I didn't mind playing there, but this was March and a dark day. Still, I could switch the light on, and my room contained the only table I could after myself and my jigsaw. I spilled the jigsaw onto the table. The chair sat, its back to the dark yawn of the fireplace. I moved it hastily to the foot of the bed facing the door. I spread the jigsaw. There was a piece of the edge, another. By lunchtime, I'd assembled the edge. "You look pleased with yourself," my father said. I didn't notice the approach of night. I was fitting together my own blue sky above fragmented cottages. After dinner, I hurried to put the pieces I'd placed mentally while eating. I hesitated outside my room. I should have to reach into the dark for the light switch. When I did, the wallpaper filled with bright multiplied airplanes and engines. I wish we could afford to redecorate my room. It seemed childish now. The fireplace gaped. I retrieved the fire guard from the cupboard under the stairs, where my father had stored it now. The nights were a little warmer. It covered the soot-encrusted yawn. The room felt comfortable now. I'd never seen before how much space it gave me for play. I even felt safe in my bed. I switched out the nightlight, but that was too much. I grabbed the light. I didn't mind its glow on its own, without the jagged lurid jig of some of the shadows, and the fire guard was comforting. It made me feel that nothing could emerge from the chimney. On Monday, I took my space toys to school. People asked to look at them. Eventually, they lent me books. In the following weeks, some of my fears began to fade. Questions darting from desk to desk still made me uneasy. But if I had to stand up without the answer, at least I knew that the other boys weren't sneering at me. Not all of them. I was beginning to have friends. I started to sympathize with their own ignorant silences. In the July examinations, I was more relaxed and scored more marks. I was even sorry to leave my friends for the summer. I invited some of them home. I felt triumphant. I'd called my mother and my room all by myself, just by realizing what had to be done. I suppose that sense of triumph helped me. It must have given me a little strength with which to face the real terror. It was early August, the week before our holiday. My mother was worrying over the luggage. My father was trying to calculate his accounts. They were beginning to chafe against each other. I went to my room to stay out of their way. I was halfway through the jigsaw, which one of my friends had swapped for mine. People sat in back gardens, letting the evening settle on them. Between the houses, the sky was pale yellow. I inserted pieces easily, relaxed by the nearness of our holiday. I listened to the slowing of the city, a radio fluttering along a street, something moving behind the fire guard in the chimney. No, it was my mother in the next room, moving luggage. It was someone dragging something, anything, outside. But I couldn't deceive my ears. In the chimney, something large had moved. It might have been a bird, stunned or dying, struggling feebly, except that a bird could have sounded wilder. It could have been a mouse, even a rat, if such things are found in chimneys. But it sounded like a large body, groping stealthily in the dark. Something large that didn't want me to hear it. It sounded like the worst terror of my infancy. I'd almost forgotten that. When I was 3 years old, my mother had let me watch television. It was bad for my eyes, but just this once, near Christmas, I'd seen 2 children asleep in bed, an enormous crimson man emerging from the fireplace, creeping towards them. They weren't going to wake up. "Burglar, burglar," I'd scream, beginning to cry. "No, dear, it's Father Christmas," my mother said, hastily switching off the television. "He always comes out of the chimney." Perhaps if she'd said down rather than out of. For months after that, in the weeks before several Christmases, I lay awake listening fearfully for a movement in the chimney. I was sure a fat, grinning figure would creep upon me if I'd slept. My mother had told me the presents that appeared at the end of my bed were left by Father Christmas. But now the mysterious visitor had a face and a huge body, squeezed into the dark chimney among the soot. When I heard the wind breathing in the chimney, I had to trap my screams between my lips. Of course, at last I began to suspect there was no Father Christmas. How did he manage to steal into my father's shop for my presents? It was a childish idea, I was almost sure, but I was too embarrassed to ask my parents or my friends. But I wanted not to believe in him, that silent lurker in the chimney, and now I didn't. Not really, except that something large was moving softly behind the fire guard. It had stopped. I stared at the wire mesh, half expecting a fat pale face to stare out of the grate. There was nothing but the fence dark. Cats were moaning in the garden. An ice cream van wandered brightly. After a while I forced myself to pull the fire guard away. I was taller than the fireplace now, but I had to stoop to peer up the dark sooted ridge throat, and then it loomed over me. Darkness full of menace, of the threat of a huge figure bursting out at me, its red mouth cramped with sparkling teeth. As I peered up, trembling a little, I tried to persuade myself that what I'd heard had flown away or scurried back into its hole. So it came trickling down from the dark, and I heard the sound of a huge body squeezed into the sooty passage, settling itself carefully, more comfortably in its burrow. I slammed the guard into place and fled. I had to gulp to breathe. I ran onto the landing, trying to catch my breath so as to cry for help. Downstairs, my mother was nervously asking whether she should pack another of my father's shirts. Yes, if you'd like, he said irritably. No, I mustn't cry out. I vowed not to upset her. But how could I go back into my room? Suddenly, I had a thought that seemed to help. At school, we'd learned how sweeps had used to send small boys up chimneys. There had hardly been room for the boys to climb. How could a large man fit in there? He couldn't. Gradually, I managed to persuade myself. At last, I opened the door of my room. The chimney was silent. There was no wind. I tried not to think he was holding himself still, waiting to squeeze out stealthily, waiting for a dark. Later, lying in the steady glow from my plastic lantern, I tried to hold on to the silence, tried to believe there was nothing near me to shatter it. There was nothing except, eventually, sleep. Perhaps if I'd cried out on the landing, I would have been saved from my fear. But I was happy with my rationality. Only once, nearly asleep, I'd wished the fire were lit, because it would burn anything that might be hiding in the chimney. That had never occurred to me before. But it didn't matter, for the next day, we went on holiday. My parents liked to sleep in the sunlight, beneath the newspaper masks. In the evenings, they liked to stroll along the wide, sandy streets. I didn't, and befriended Nigel, the son of another family who were staying in the boarding house. My mother encouraged the friendship. Such a nice boy, 2 years older than me. He looked after me. He had money, and the hope of a mustache shadowing his pimply upper lip. One evening, he took me to the fairground, where we met 2 girls. He and the older girl went to buy ice creams, while her younger friend and I stared at each other timidly. I couldn't believe the young girl didn't like jigsaws. Later, while I was contradicting her, Nigel and his companion disappeared behind the ghost train. But Nigel reappeared almost at once, red face, his left cheek redder. "Where's Rose?" I asked, bewildered. "She had to go." He seemed furious that I'd asked. "Isn't she coming back?" "No." He was glancing irritably for a change of subject. What a super bike, he said, pointing it as I glided between the stalls. Have you got a bike? No, I said. I keep asking Father Christmas, but I wish that hadn't gone past me, for he was staring at me, winking at the young girl. Do you still believe in him? He demanded scornfully. No, of course I don't. I was only kidding. Did he believe me? He was edging towards the young girl now, putting his arm around her. Soon she excused herself and didn't come back. I never knew her name. I was annoyed he'd make her run away. Where did Rose go? I asked persistently. He didn't tell me, but perhaps he resented my insistence, for as the family left the boarding house, I heard him say loudly to his mother, he still believes in Father Christmas. My mother heard that too, and glanced anxiously at me. Well, I didn't. There was nobody in the chimney waiting for me to come home. I didn't care that we were going home the next day. That night, I pulled away the fire guard and saw a fat, pale face hanging down into the fireplace, like an underbelly, upside down and smiling. But I managed to wake, and eventually the sea lulled me back to sleep. As soon as we reached home, I ran upstairs. I uncovered the fireplace and stood staring to discover what I felt. Gradually, I filled with the scorn Nigel would have felt had he known my fear. How could I have been so childish? The chimney was only a passage for smoke, a hole into which wind wandered sometimes. That night, exhausted by my journey home, I slept at once. The nights darkened into October. The darkness behind the mesh grew thicker. I used to feel, as summer waned, that the chimney was insinuating its darkness into my room. Now the sight only reminded me I'd have a fire soon. The fire would be comforting. It was October when my father's Christmas cards arrived. On a Saturday, I was working in the shop. It annoyed him to have to anticipate Christmas so much to compete with the supermarket. I hardly noticed the cards. My head felt muffled, my body cold. Perhaps it was the weather's sudden hint of winter. My mother came home to the shop that afternoon. I watched her pretend not to have seen the cards. When I looked away, she began to pick them up timidly, as if they were unfaithful letters, glancing anxiously at me. I didn't know what was on her mind. My head was throbbing. I wasn't going home sick. I earned pocket money in the shop. Besides, I didn't want my father to think I was still weak. Nor did I want my mother to worry. That night, I lay slumped in a chair, pretending to read. Words trickled down the page. I felt like dirty clothes someone had thrown on a chair. My father was at the shop taking stock. My mother sat gazing at me. I pretended harder the words waltzed slowly. At last she said, Are you listening? I was now, though I didn't look up. Yes, I said hoarsely, unplugging my throat with a roar. Do you remember when you were a baby? There was a film you saw of Father Christmas coming out of the chimney. Her voice sounded bravely careless, falsely light, as if she were determined to make some awful revelation. I couldn't look up. Yes, I said. Her silence made me glance. She looked as she had on my first day at school, full of loss, of despair. Perhaps she was realizing I had to grow up, but to my throbbing head, her look only suggested terror, as if she were about to deliver me up as a sacrifice. I couldn't tell you the truth then, she said. You were too young. The truth was terror, her expression. Promise that. Father Christmas isn't really like that, she said. My illness must have shown by then. She gazed at me. Her lips trembled. I can't, she said, turning her face away. Your father must tell you. But that left me poised on the edge of terror. I felt unnerved, rustily tense. I wanted very much to lie down. I'm going to my room, I said. stumbled upstairs, hardly aware of doing so. As much as anything, I was fleeing her unease. The stairs swayed a little. They felt unnaturally soft underfoot. I hurried dully into my room. I slapped the light switch and missed. I was walking uncontrollably forward into blinding dark. A figure came to meet me, soft and huge in the dark of my room. I cried out. I managed to stagger back onto the landing, grabbing the light switch as I went. The lighted room was empty. My mother came running upstairs, almost falling. "What is it? What is it?" she cried. I mustn't say. "I'm ill. I feel sick." I did, and a minute later I was. When she put me to bed, she made to go next door for the doctor. "Don't leave me," I pleaded. The walls of the room swayed as if tugged by firelight. The fireplace was huge and very dark. As soon as my father opened the front door, she ran downstairs crying, he's ill, go for the doctor." The doctor came and prescribed for my fever. My mother sat up beside me. Eventually, my father came to suggest it was time she went to bed. They were going to leave me alone in my room. "Make a fire," I pleaded. My mother touched my forehead. "But you're burning," she said. "No, I'm cold. I want a fire, please." So she made one, tired as she was. I saw my father's disgust as he watched me use her worry against her to get what I wanted, his disgust with her for letting herself be used. I didn't care. My mother's halting words had overgrown my mind. What had she been unable to tell me? Had it had to do with the sounds I heard in the chimney? The room lulled around me. Nothing was sure, but the fire would make sure for me. Nothing in the chimney could survive it. I made my mother stay until the fire was blazing. Suppose a huge shape burst forth from the hearth, dripping fire. When at last I let her go, I lay lapped by firelight and meshy shadows, which seemed lovely now in my warm room. I felt feverish, but not unpleasantly. I was content to voyage on my rocking bed. The ceiling swayed past above me. While I slept, the fire went out. My fever kept me warm. I slid out of bed and, pulling away the fire guard, reached up the chimney. At the length of my arms, I touched something heavy, hanging down in the dark. It yielded, then soft, fat fingers groped down and closed on my wrist. My mother was holding my wrist as she washed my hands. "You mustn't get out of bed," she said when I realized that I was awake. I stared stupidly at her. "You'd got out of bed. You were sleepwalking," she explained. "You had your hands right up the chimney." I saw now that she was washing cake soot from my hands. Tracks of ash led towards the bed. It had only been a dream. One moment the fat hand had been gripping my wrist. The next it was my mother's cool, slim fingers. My mother played word games and timid chess with me while I stayed in bed, that day and the next. The third night I felt better. The fire fluttered gently. I felt comfortably warm. Tomorrow I'd get up. I should have to go back to school soon, but I didn't mind that unduly. I lay and listened to the breathing of the wind in the chimney. When I awoke, the fire had gone out. The room was full of darkness. The wind still breathed, but it seemed somehow closer. It was above me. Someone was standing over me. It couldn't be either my parents, not in the sightless darkness. I lay rigid. Most of all, I wished I hadn't let Nigel's imagined contempt persuade me to do without a nightlight. The breathing was slow, irregular. It sounded clogged and feeble. As I tried to inch silently towards the far side of the bed, the source of the breathing stooped towards me. I felt its breath waver on my face, and the breath sprinkled me with something like dry rain. When I had lain paralyzed for what I felt like blind hours, the breathing went away. It was in the chimney, dislodging soot. It might be the wind, but I knew it had come out to let me know that whatever the fire had done to it, it hadn't been killed. It had emerged to tell me that it would come for me on Christmas Eve. I began to scream. I wouldn't tell my mother why. She washed my face, which was freckled with soot. "You've been sleepwalking again." She tried to reassure me, but I wouldn't let her leave me until daylight. When she'd gone, I saw the ashy tracks leading from the chimney to the bed. Perhaps I had been sleepwalking and dreaming. I searched vainly for my nightlight. I would have been ashamed to ask for a new one, and that helped me to feel I could do without. At dinner, I felt secure enough to say I didn't know why I screamed. "But you must remember, you sounded so frightened. You upset me." My father was folding the evening paper into a thick wad the size of a pocketbook, which he could read beside his plate. "Leave the boy alone," he said. "You imagine all sorts of things when you're feverish. I did it when I was his age." It was the first time he'd admitted anything like weakness to me. If he'd managed to survive his nightmares, why should mine disturb me more? Tired out by the demands of my fever, I slept soundly that night. The chimney was silent except for the flapping of flames. But my father didn't help me again. One November afternoon, I was standing behind the counter, hoping for customers. My father pottered, grumpily fingering packets of nylons, tins of pet food, dinky toys, baby's rattles, cards, searching for signs of theft. Suddenly, he snatched a Christmas card and strode to the counter. "Sit down," he said grimly. He was waving the card at me like evidence. I sat down on a shelf, but then a lady came into the shop. The bell thumped. I stood up to sell her nylons. When she'd gone, I gazed at my father, anxious to hear the worst. "Just sit down," he said. He couldn't stand my being taller than he was. His size embarrassed him, but he wouldn't let me see that. He pretended I had to sit down out of respect. "Your mother says she tried to tell you about Father Christmas," he said. She must have told him that weeks earlier. He put off talking to me because we'd never been close, and now we're growing further apart. "I don't know why she couldn't tell you," he said. But he wasn't telling me either. He was looking at me if I were a stranger he had to chat to. I felt uneasy, unsure now that I wanted to hear what he wanted to say. A man was approaching the shop. I stood up, hoping he'd interrupt. He did, and I served him. Then, to delay my father's revelation, I adjusted stacks of tins. My father stared at me in disgust. "If you don't watch out, you'll be as bad as your mother." I found the idea of being like my mother strange, indefinably disturbing. But he wouldn't let me be like him, wouldn't let me near. All right, I'd be brave. I'd listen to what he had to say. But he said, "Oh, it's not worth me trying to tell you. You'll find out." He meant I must find out for myself that Father Christmas was a childish fantasy. He didn't mean he wanted the thing from the chimney to come for me. The disgust in his eyes didn't mean that. It didn't. He meant that I had to behave like a man. And I could. I'd show him. The chimney was silent. I needn't worry until Christmas Eve. Nor then. There was nothing to come out. One evening as I walked home, I saw Dr. Flynn in his front room. He was standing before a mirror, gazing at his red fur-trimmed hooded suit. He stooped to pick up his beard. My mother told me that he was going to act Father Christmas at the children's hospital. She seemed on the whole glad that I had seen. So was I. It proved the pretense was only for children. Except the glimpse reminded me of how near Christmas was. As the nights closed on the days, and the days rushed by, the end of the term party, the turkey, decorations in the house, I grew tense, trying to prepare myself. For what? For nothing. Nothing at all. Well, I would know soon. For suddenly, it was Christmas Eve. I was busy all day. I washed up as my mother prepared Christmas dinner. I brought her ingredients and hurried to buy some she'd used up. I stuck the day's cards to tapes above the mantelpiece. I carried home a tinsel tree which nobody had bought, but being busy only made the day move faster. Before I knew it, the windows were full of night. Christmas Eve, well, it didn't worry me. I was too old for that sort of thing. The tinsel tree rustled when anyone passed it. Light rolled in tinsel globes. Streamers flinched back when the doors opened. Swinging restlessly on tapes above the mantelpiece were half a dozen red-checked smiling bearded faces. The night piled against the windows. I chattered to my mother about her shouting father, her elder sisters, the time her sisters had locked her in a cellar. My father grunted occasionally, even when I'd run out of subjects to discuss with my mother, and tried to talk to him about the shop. At least he hadn't noticed how late I was staying up. But he had. It's about time everyone was in bed, he said, with a kind of suppressed fury. Can I have some more coal? My mother would never let me have a coal scuttle in the bedroom. She didn't want me going near the fire. To put on now, I said. Surely she must say yes. It'll be cold in the morning, I said. Yes, you take some. You don't want to be cold when you're looking out with Father at your presents. I hurried upstairs with the scuttle. Over its clatter I heard my father say, Are you still at that? Can't you let him grow up? I almost emptied the scuttle into the fire, which rose roaring and crackling. My father's voice was an angry mumble, seeping through the floor. When I carried the scuttle down, my mother's eyes were red. My father looked furiously, determined. I'd always found their arguments frightening. I was glad to hurry to my room. It seemed welcoming. The fire was bright within the mesh. I heard my mother come upstairs. That was comforting, too. She was nearer now. I heard my father go next door to wish the doctor happy Christmas, I supposed. I didn't mind the reminder. There was nothing of Christmas Eve in my room, except the pillowcase waiting to be filled with presents on the floor at the foot of the bed. I pushed it aside with one foot, the better to ignore it. I slid into bed. My father came upstairs. I heard further mumblings of argument through the bedroom. At last they stopped, and I tried to relax. I lay glad of the silence. The wind was rushing the house. It puffed down the chimney. Smoke trickled through the fire guard. Now the wind was breathing brokenly. It was only the wind. It didn't bother me. Perhaps I'd put too much coal on the fire. The room was hot. I was sweating. I felt almost feverish. The huge mesh flicked over the wall repeatedly, nervously like a rapid net. Within the mirror of the dimmer room danced. Suddenly, I was a little afraid. Not that something would come out of the chimney. That was stupid. Afraid that my feeling of fever would make me feel delirious again. It seemed years since I had been disturbed by the sight of the room in the mirror, but I was disturbed now. There was something wrong with that dim, jerking room. The wind breathed. Only the wind. I couldn't hear its changing. A fat billow of smoke squeezed through the mesh. The room seemed more oppressive now and smelled of smoke. It didn't smell entirely like coal smoke, but I couldn't tell what else was burning. I didn't want to get up to find out. I must lie still, otherwise I'd be writhing about trying to clutch at sleep, as if I had the second night of my fever, and sometimes in summer. I must sleep before the room grew too hot. I must keep my eyes shut. I mustn't be distracted by the faint trickling of soot, nor the panting of the wind, nor the shadows and orange light that snatched at my eyes through my eyelids. I woke in darkness. The fire had gone out. No, it was still there when I opened my eyes. Subdued orange crawled on embers. A few weak flames leapt repetitively. The room was moving more slowly now. The dim room in the mirror, the face peering out at me, jerked faintly, as if almost dead. I couldn't look at that. I slid farther down the bed, dragging the pillow into my nest. I was too hot, but at least beneath the sheets I felt safe. I began to relax. Then I realized what I'd seen. The light had been dim, but I was almost sure the fire guard was standing away from the hearth. I must have mistaken that. In the dim light, I wasn't feverish. I couldn't have sleptwalked again. There was no need for me to look. I was comfortable, but I was beginning to admit that I'd better look when I heard the slithering in the chimney. Something large was coming down, a fall of soot. I could hear the scattering parts of soot in the grate thrown down by a harsh halting wind. But the wind was emerging from the fireplace into the room. It was above me, panting through its obstructed throat. I lay staring up at the mask of my sheets. I trembled from holding myself immobile. My held breath filled me painfully as lumps of rock. I only had to lie there until whatever was above me went away. It couldn't touch me. The clogged breath bent nearer. I could hear its dry rattling. Then something began to fumble at the sheets over my face. It plucked feebly at them, trying to grasp them, as if it had hardly anything to grasp with. My own hands clutched at the sheets from within, but couldn't hold them down entirely. The sheets were being tugged from me, a fraction at a time. Soon I would be face to face with my visitor. I was laying there with my eyes squeezed tight when it let go of the sheets and went away. My throbbing lungs had forced me to take shallow breaths. Now I breathed slightly open mouth, though it filled my mouth with fluff. The tolling of my ears subsided, and I realized the thing had not returned to the chimney. It was still in the room. I couldn't hear its breathing. It couldn't be near me. Only that thought allowed me to look. That and the desperate hope that I might escape, since it moved so slowly. I peeled the sheets down from my face slowly, stealthily, until my eyes were bare. My heartbeat shook me. In the sluggishly shifting light, I saw a figure at the foot of the bed. Its red costume was thickly furred with soot. It had its back to me. Its breathing was muffled by the hood. What shocked me most was its size. It occurred to me, somewhere amid my engulfing terror, that burning shrivels things. The figure stood in the mirror as well, in the dim, twitching room. A face peered out of the hood in the mirror, like a charred turnip carved with a rigid grin. The stunted figure was still moving painfully. It edged round the foot of the bed and stooped to my pillowcase. I saw it draw the pillowcase up over itself and sink down. As it sank, its hood fell back, and I saw the charred turnip roll about in the hood, as if there were almost nothing left to support it. I should have had to pass the pillowcase to reach the door. I couldn't move. The room seemed enormous and was growing darker. My parents were far away. At last I managed to drag the sheets over my face and pulled the pillow, like muffs, around my ears. I had lain sleeplessly for hours when I heard movement at the foot of my bed. The thing had gone out of its sack again. It was coming towards me. It was tugging at the sheets more strongly now. Before I could catch hold of the sheets, I glimpsed a red fur-trimmed sleeve and was screaming. "Let go, will you?" my father said irritably. "Good God, it's only me." He was wearing Dr. Flynn's disguise, which flapped about him, the jacket at least, his pajamas cuffed peaked beneath it. I stopped screaming and began to giggle hysterically. I think he would have struck me, but my mother ran in. "It's all right, she reassured me, and explained to him. "It's the shock." He was making angrily for the door when she said, "Don't go yet, Albert. Stay while he opens his presents," and lifting the bulging pillowcase from the floor, dumped it beside me. I couldn't push it away. I couldn't let her see my terror. I made myself pull out my presents onto the daylight. Books, sweets, ballpoints. As I groped deeper, I wondered whether the charred face would crumble when I touched it. Sweat pricked my hands. They shook with horror. They could, because my mother couldn't see them. The pillowcase contained nothing but presents and a pinch of soot. When I was sure it was empty, I slumped against the headboard, panting. "He's tired," my mother said, in defense of my ingratitude. "He was up very late last night." Later, I managed an accident, dropping the pillowcase on the fire downstairs. I managed to eat Christmas dinner and to go to bed that night. I lay awake, even though I was sure nothing would come out of the chimney now. Later, I realized why my father had come to my room in the morning dressed like that. He'd intended me to catch him, to cure me of the pretense. But it was many years before I enjoyed Christmas very much. When I left school, I went to work in libraries. 10 years later, I married. My wife and I crossed town weekly to visit my parents. My mother chattered, my father was taciturn. I don't think he'd ever quite forgave me for laughing at him. One winter night, our telephone rang. I answered it, hoping it wasn't the police. My library was then suffering from robberies. All I wanted was to sit before the fire and imagine the glittering cold outside. But it was Dr. Flynn. "Your parents' house is on fire," he told me. "Your father's trapped in there. Your mother needs you." They had a friend to stay. My mother had lit a little fire in the guest room, my old bedroom. A spark had eluded the fire guard, and the carpet had caught fire. Impatient for the fire engine, my father ran back into the house to put the fire out, but had been overcome. All this I learned later. Now I drove coldly across town towards the glow in the sky. The glow was doused by the time I arrived. Smoke scrolled over the roof, but my mother had found a coal sack and was struggling still to run into the house to beat out the fire. Her friend and Dr. Flynn held her back. She dropped the sack and ran to me. "Oh, it's your father, it's Albert," she repeated through her weeping. The firemen withdrew their hose. The ambulance stood winking. I saw the front door open and a stretcher carried out. The path was wet and frosty. One stretcher bearer slipped, and the contents of the stretcher spilled over the path. I saw Dr. Flynn glance at my mother. Only the fear that she might turn caused him to act. He grabbed the sack and, running to the path, scooped up what lay scattered there. I saw the charred head rolled on the lip of the sack before it dropped within. I had seen that already years ago. My mother came to live with us, but we could see she was pining. My parents must have loved each other in their way. She died a year later. Perhaps I killed them both. I know that what emerged from the chimney was in some sense my father, but surely that was a premonition. Surely my fear could never have reached out to make him die that way. Well, that's all we have for tonight. I really hope you enjoy these little terrifying tales. I know that I do. But as always, thank you guys so much for watching. Good night.